I mean to say that subsequently to the period when Ligeia's beauty passed into my spirit, there dwelling as in a shrine, I derived from many existences in the material world. Greetings, Poe fans. I am Carmen Bolden.
I'm Jeanie Smith, and
we are the
Fantastic
Two. Welcome back to October.
Yes, and it's a fantastic October so far because the weather seems to be in Tennessee catching up to somewhat of an autumn level. We're not the blazing side of the sun. I knock on wood. So
yes, and I just came back into Tennessee from, I guess you could say, flying back like a raven from the Poe Fest in Baltimore last weekend, and was able to celebrate Poe, well, I guess memorialize Poe's death on October 7th at right in front of his house.
No, that's creepy.
Yeah, I know.
I didn't show up.
Yeah, and we didn't get to go to his grave and visit. However, I've been there multiple times, but we did drive by it a couple times because of the route we took. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, hey, you were there. You got to bask in his spirit being in where he died. So that's always good.
Absolutely. And the Poe Fest this year was amazing. They've expanded it. And so, if you're in that area or can travel to that area, definitely go next year in 2024.
Absolutely. And we'll see you there. You can always spot us.
That's right.
The circling ravens.
Yes. So, Jeanie, what is on tap for tonight?
Well, considering it is the month of October and there's a lot goes on in the month of October, one thing, as we were discussing, is poor Poe, he met his demise in the month of October under rather mysterious circumstances. So many different myths around how he truly died, but we do know that he did die on October the 7th.
Correct.
But he was found in an unconscious state on the 3rd.
Yes.
And then it took till the 7th before he finally just gave it up and left this earthly plane.
Right.
But thing that's in October that we always love is Halloween. And with Halloween, everybody wants to try to scare everybody to death and all the horror. And then that automatically makes you think of, the horror movies. Well, something else that's happening in the month of October is Friday the 13th.
Yes, and that's unusual for that to be in the same month.
Exactly. So it's all kind of coming together in a trifecta. There's also going to be a solar eclipse this month. So it's rather synergy seems to be going on. But the one thing this all runs down to with Halloween, Friday the 13th, because Friday the 13th was a very prevalent horror franchise that came into the industry. And the things that we're going to talk about is horror. And one of the most prominent fathers of horror, and especially for the film, is good old Alfred Hitchcock.
Yes. Do 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 do. And we're going psycho as we're doing that.
Yeah. Which that's the other thing. We definitely live in the world of psychotics, because and who better to match up with Psycho than good old Edgar Allan Poe?
Absolutely, with the psychology and mixing in with Hitchcock and the influences that Poe had on Hitchcock, which is really cool. And so,
one of the things I wanted to bring up that's ironic, it was 90 years after Poe's birth that Alfred Hitchcock was born.
That's true. Yeah, because let's kind of talk about and give our listeners a
little Alfred Hitchcock. Most people don't know about Alfred Hitchcock other than he did Psycho and Rear Window.
Yeah, and I almost think most Hitchcockian fans definitely know Rear Window, but to me, I think Psycho and The Birds are probably the most known. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, no, probably not everybody knows about Rear Window because you definitely have to be more of a Hitchcock fan to
Yeah,
follow that. But
yeah,
yeah, Psycho
or
definitely,
or
and The
like a
Bird absolutely,
or like a Jimmy Stewart or a Grace Kelly fan.
exactly.
Yeah,
That's
so just like Jenny was saying, Hitchcock was born on August 13th, 1899. However, that was not a Friday the 13th. Jeannie, look that up.
yeah. I looked it up. However, one of the cool things about it, though, that I found that if he had lived to 1999, his 100th birthday would have fallen on a Friday the 13th.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yes. And what's really unusual is that his very first film that he ever did was
Mm-hmm.
it never got off the way or anything like that, never made it popular. It bombed, so it never did anything. But yeah, he filmed a movie called 13.
Interesting.
Yeah. So okay, go ahead. You more.
Oh yeah.
Let's get
Okay.
the biography of who Alfred Hitchcock was.
Yes. And so he was born in Leytonstone, England. Leytonstone, England. Try to do a little British there. He
Yep.
was the youngest of the children of William and Emma Jane Hitchcock. And so he had a couple of older siblings. And he really, he had a pretty happy childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was 15, he attended a school that was more like technical for becoming a draftsman. Some of his first jobs were in advertising, and that's where he kind of got his connection to go into work on film. And believe it or not, he actually did some writing for a magazine. Did you run across that in your research?
Well, no, I didn't go delving that far because I've been mostly looking at his things that he was known for with production, whether it be silent films or some of the
Right.
other films. So I didn't
Okay.
go far, but yeah, you go for it.
Yeah. So when he was doing his advertising work, he was a founding editor of the Henley Telegraph, which was a magazine that produced short pieces, like little short stories, poems, advertisements, and things like that. Some of the first writing that he did as a contributor for this magazine was called Gas, and the first issue was in June of 1919. And this little short story, a dramatic piece with a touch of dark humor, which sounds very Poe-esque if you really think about it,
Right.
with like Poe's satire. He published this in the magazine, and it basically is about a kind of a dreamlike, horrific experience of a woman having her teeth worked on. So I
Oh,
thought that was really very interesting.
yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things that we were discussing earlier about a crossover is that the women in Hitchcock's movies are, very prominent and situated as characters that kind of push the storyline. So if we jump into Edgar Allan Poe, he had the same thing in his stories that, some of them that we know there was narrators. The narrators could have been male or female,
Right.
but we know that a lot of Poe's influences were women in his life.
Yeah.
So that crossover, in my opinion, between the personalities of the two.
Yeah, and in one of the books about Hitchcock called The Dark Side of Genius,
Mm-hmm.
Donald Spotto was the author. This is what he said of this story, Gas. He found the story a sophomoric Poe imitation, plainly evidencing the Hitchcockian images of sadism. So I thought that was really interesting.
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of the critics seem to be throughout generations similar in their interpretation of certain people. So I can see them marking Hitchcock along with Poe and not being very much fans of his.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay. They didn't
But
need.
but yeah, and I mean, and when you think about it, that was his first piece that he published, and so all writers have to grow, and so saying it's sophomoric, you almost have to give him a little time to gain his what's yeah.
Because a lot of them, especially when it comes to writing or storytelling or filmmaking, doesn't mean that every one that you do, the very first one you do, is going to be a blockbuster hit or going to
That's
be.
right. That's right.
You don't ever want whatever you do, the very first one, to be the most notorious, because that means that anything that comes after it, you're going to have a very high bar to try to reach.
Yeah. Another, like later that year in the magazine in September of 1919, he published a story called The Woman's Part. And what's really very interesting about this is that idea within an idea of the structure of the whole story kind of came about. And it's almost like a story within a story, very allegorical. And so when you think about it, you've got several things that can kind of connect Poe, or maybe, there's nothing that I could find that showed how much Hitchcock read of Poe. But when you think about the idea within an idea, you've got the poem Dream Within a Dream. You've got that allegorical part of the fall of the House of Usher. You've got the haunted palace, woven into the story. And so it's just very, very interesting that Hitchcock did this in his writing. And so you really kind of wonder how much of Poe did he really, really, was there an influence? And I know we're going to talk a lot more about the films in just a minute. But one of the things I wanted to read was a quote that Hitchcock actually said about his influence from Poe. And that goes as this. He also came under the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, who told, and this is in Hitchcock words, a completely unbelievable story to the readers with such a spellbinding logic that you get the impression that the same thing could happen to you tomorrow. And I know that was not Hitchcockian, but if my voice was a little bit better tonight, I could have done it a whole lot better, like the good evening.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, I'll read that again because I think that came out horribly. He also came under the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, who told a completely unbelievable story to the readers with such a spellbinding logic that you get the impression that the same thing could happen to you tomorrow. So it's almost like the reality of what Poe wrote, what Alfred Hitchcock's producing in film, is like the everyday man, the man in the crowd.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, because you have to look at it also from the aspect of two different mediums.
Yeah.
Because Hitchcock wasn't writing his stories.
Right.
Stories that he made into movies weren't something that he wrote.
Yeah.
These were novels or stories that someone else had written, and he just turned them into screenwrite.
Exactly.
Into screenwrite.
Yeah.
So he was more on the visionary side of making it, rather leaving it to the imagination. In a book, he was putting that imagination into life.
Right.
And I think he chose some very well-known storylines.
Absolutely.
It could happen. And what's so even strange, in my opinion, is that the ones that he did, like The Birds, for instance.
Yeah.
When we were going through the pandemic in 2020 and everyone was being sequestered all over the world and not going outside as much, it seemed like the animals were trying to take back. And there was a lot more that came about. We had dolphins showing up in areas that they'd never shown up before. We had whales coming out places. We had birds that were flying to different areas. So that always brought me back to the birds when I thought about it. I'm like, well, nature attacking. And one thing that many people don't understand about the birds is the birds take their flight and they fly based on the electromagnetic pulse of the earth.
Right.
That atmospheric bubble that we're in is what allows birds to have their GPS, basically.
Yeah.
Fly. So anything that interrupts that's why sometimes we see birds just fall out of the sky.
Right.
And it's like, okay, so things like that can happen. And so when he made these movies, it was like, oh, wow, never really thought about that. Because most of the times when we watch movies nowadays, they're so out there that we're like, that's never going to happen to me.
Right.
But that's one thing, like you said, Hitchcock made it to where this is going to be an everyday occurrence kind of thing, something that can happen.
Yeah. And, when Hitchcock made film, there was no CGI, and he had to create these things out of what was available and the trick of the camera and things like that. And I can't remember the gentleman's name, but in the one book I'm reading, it's called Alfred Hitchcock, A Life in Darkness and Light by Patrick McGilligan, and it's an excellent book. It's a very large book, and so I haven't had time to read the whole thing yet. However, Hitchcock was very dedicated to having the same people working with him to make sure that they could create what they needed to create. And we just want to add in before we forget, this month, October 2023, marks the 60th anniversary of the movie The Birds. And so check your listings, because in some theaters, they are showing The Birds. So go check it out if you haven't. It's excellent. And it's actually a story by Daphne du Maurier. And it's loosely based on that book or story, but it's great. The story is great too if you read it and then watch The Birds.
Yeah, exactly. And like some of these that you will find that when they talk about Hitchcock and his filmography, days that when he came from silent films.
Right.
And there was no talking, there was just moving pictures, black and white, nothing. But then all of a sudden he had to go into this type of thing. But one of the things that made him so good at his job was that he used full orchestra soundtracks.
Yes.
And he would find innovative, dynamic methods for shooting everything. Like he would make sure that he shot 20 different angles of a staircase, just a standard staircase.
Right.
But he would present it in 20 different angles, and then he would put them together, and it would create like this total 4D dimension.
Yeah.
Staircase that you would like, whoa, why, what? But that's what we were talking about. He didn't have CGI. He didn't have all these major computer graphics technology to help him. He had to create it using what he had. And that included special effects that were people putting together fireworks, explosions, or it was the people in the background making the heavy steps, or shooting a real life gun in the background just to give it that, vision.
Yeah. So, well, in reality.
In reality. So it always amazes me that he could use the visualization of what he was reading, what he read, and turn it into something that was so phenomenal. Even though he started out in black and white and then it went into color, but even when it went into color, he still didn't. It was simplification is what I'm getting to.
Right. Yes.
One of his major successes was simplification. That's why I tie him a lot into Poe. And I think he was influenced with Poe because of the people when he was growing up were influenced with Poe.
Right. Because
you can't tell me that Orson Welles and I think Ray Bradbury was in that time.
Yep. No, Ray Bradbury's after. Ray Bradbury.
Yeah, a little after that, but no, I mean Agatha Christie. That's who I was thinking of.
Yeah.
And all of those that were being influenced, H.G. Wells, that was the other one. They had been influenced by Poe. They couldn't help but be,
Yeah.
you know.
And well, if you think about it, um, Hitchcock was born 50 years after Poe died. I mean, that's
Exactly.
not that much time.
No, I mean, and albeit history wise, a lot of things happened in America in those 50 years, but he was born in London, but
Right.
he became an American phenomenon, in my opinion, because he shot American films.
Absolutely. I mean, and he definitely was, shooting all his films in England before,
Mm-hmm.
coming over to Hollywood. But it's very interesting. His first talkie was 1929, and the movie was Blackmail.
Mm-hmm.
And he did not want to go into talking movies because
No.
the words got in the way, which
Yes.
I thought was very interesting. But, Jeannie and I were talking about this, off camera before
Uh-huh.
we talk tonight. You give up control when
Yep.
you're having to depend on somebody else remembering their lines. And
Mm-hmm.
when he was in control of just the picture, he had the ultimate control. And so I can see where that would be scary. What if the actor you want doesn't have the voice you want?
Exactly. They may have the look, but they don't have the voice. Now,
Right. Or the memorization power.
yes, in some instances, that a lot of people they use the picture of the actor or actress, but then they
Yeah.
do overs in modern times, like if they don't have the right voice, and even body doubles. They've done body doubles, but I can see where Hitchcock, being a man who started out in silent films, where it was just all about showing someone something and them having to interpret it without having words.
Yeah.
Kind of the exact flip from Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe was writing the words and building the pictures in the reader's mind as they were reading the words. Hitchcock was using the visual of the people's body language, because most people, body language is a language.
Right.
A lot
It's
of
huge. It's huge,
It's
really.
huge. So he was using that body language and those moments, those situations to tell the story.
Yeah.
And so he was doing the exact same thing Poe was doing, but the opposite way.
Right.
And he was still very good at it. And I can see why he was like, oh, great. Now I got to put up with people talking.
Exactly. Well, and then another thing too that was an influence for Hitchcock, that it's very similar to Poe, was he married Alma Reville in 1926, and she
Mm-hmm.
was his assistant director. She had a very large hand in his early films, working with him, and he always considered her part of the team and
Mm-hmm.
held very respectfully, very highly in regard to her knowledge of making a good picture. But then in 1928, they had their one and only child, a daughter. She goes by Pat, but Patricia, who was in several of the Hitchcock films and on the Hitchcock Presents and the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. But once Pat came along, she kind of stepped out of the on the the stage, the sound stage, or where they're filming. She
Yeah.
wasn't as prominent working with him day by day after their daughter was born.
Yeah, because she was having to split her time
Right.
basically between being a mother and being, the right hand of Alfred Hitchcock.
Right. Right.
But that sometimes would happen,
Oh, absolutely.
especially for anyone in that type of field in that earlier years.
Yeah.
But what's so ironic is that most of the major films that Hitchcock did, kind of like with Poe and his stories, they had such a woman influence, like his own wife in real life. But some of them were so psychologically damaged, in my opinion, by
Yeah.
women, or they were pushed to the limit. Like so many of them, they're trying to kill the women.
Yeah.
They're trying to kill the women in their lives, or they do kill the women in their lives, or the women in their lives push them to kill other people. So
Right, right. I mean, the theme for Hitchcock as well as Poe, both of them have that fixation of, the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical thing in the world. And, again, I think more women died in Poe stories than Alfred Hitchcock had, die on film. But
right.
it's definitely a common theme. And, Jeannie and I were also talking about this before we started our episode
Yeah.
tonight. There's the Hitchcock blonde, that,
Oh
iconic,
yes.
cold, crisp blonde. And, from that time and era when the movies, became in color, being a blonde actress, was very prominent. But when
Yep.
you think about Poe's women, most of them, not all, but the majority of them were more brunette. So it's kind of like Hitchcock blonde, Poe brunettes. And so
Yeah.
it's just kind of an interesting little fun little thing to think about.
But it also, like we also were talking about, since his was film industry,
Right.
and that was who was making the big splash, where the film or the blonde bombshells.
Yeah.
Marilyn Monroe is the major icon with the 7 year itch. But you also had the dark haired ones, because you did have Natalie
Wood.
Wood. Yeah. Hey, that's my mom's maiden name. So how did I forget that? Okay.
That's okay. Well, but also
Natalie
too,
Wood and Julie Andrews and those types.
yeah,
But
like in The Birds, you have Suzanne Plachette, which is
mhm,
the opposite, female from Tippi Hedren.
right. But you also, in those movies, you can see that even between the difference with the blonde and the brunettes, the actual happenings are different.
Right.
Their characters are doing is different, and how
Yeah.
they're being portrayed is different. So it just seems that there's like these parallels in one way, but then there's this total flipping of the universe type of thing on your head.
It's really the antithesis of some of the things. It's not everything,
Exactly.
but it's kind of really cool. And
Mm-hmm.
so some of the things that I was reading about in the articles I found, and some things from the book. But when you think about another way Poe might have influenced Hitchcock, but also just them both being the creatives that they were,
Yep.
Hitchcock always, in most of his films, he had a little tiny cameo where he would pop in, and some are
Right.
more obvious than others. Some you have to really look, and that's kind of the fun
Mm-hmm.
little puzzle thing. But when you think about what Poe did, obviously he can't make a cameo in his own book, as
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Poe or Edgar, Eddie, however you want to refer to him.
Right.
But his writing, he actually really kind of wrote his own reflective self in all of his tales and poems. And
Mm-hmm.
so that you could kind of say that's his cameo in his own writing.
Yeah. And then we could even go a step further, saying that with the narrator could have been
Exactly. Yes.
in his own books and stuff. So, and
Yeah.
okay, I got to throw it into more things when we're talking about cameos in movies.
Hmm.
Stan Lee was the main man on doing cameos in his big movies. And I think he may have stepped into that because of Hitchcock
Hitchcock.
and
Yeah.
everything else. Because hey, this is my movie, so why don't I get to have a visual in here instead of just being behind the scenes?
Oh, yeah. The 6 degrees of separation. I mean, just thinking about
Exactly.
all the things that you,
Mm-hmm.
mimic or,
And
copy
maybe,
or whatever. It's like, oh, that's
well,
cool. I'm going to try that too.
exactly. And one of the other things that people have made mention is that Hitchcock also can be popularly known as the master of the macabre,
Right.
because, and especially the master of the wrong man thriller,
Yeah.
about the wrong man being, the accused being the one that's being chased and all this kind of stuff. and he's got that evidenced in some of his early works.
Yeah. Well, a lot of works. I mean, North by
Yeah.
Northwest, and I mean, we could probably go on and on and on.
Yes. So there's so many things about Hitchcock that he took on his plate, but he had more, in my opinion, he had more of a play area
Yeah.
than, because so he was, even though he was still sticking with movies, he wasn't doing the writing. He was just doing the choice of what he
Yeah.
put up.
Yeah.
So,
I totally agree. Um, and one of the other things, especially since we are focusing on horror, because of Poe's horror, Hitchcock's horror, because not everything was, Hitchcock did a whole lot of movies that were about espionage and spies and things like that, because that was the nature of what was going on in the world,
right.
and you can kind of, I'm not going on this route, but I'm going to mention it before I mention what I'm about to. But Poe wrote about things in the world at his time. Hitchcock made the films kind of the same way. But they both, with their building of their suspense in the writing and in the film, if it's something that had the gore, it should, like, if you, these slasher movies that are full of gore, they lacked it. They hid it because it was, let's allow the reader or the observer, the viewer, to interpret that for themselves. And that, to me, is some of the best horror, when it's that psychological piece.
Exactly. And that's the good one. That's the word I was going to bring up if we hadn't said anything about it.
Yeah.
Was the psychological aspect of it, because
Yeah.
we've always discussed about how Poe is very much a psychological writer, in my opinion.
Yeah.
All his work. So it's like, why not bring in Hitchcock and his love of the psychological aspect of
Yes.
people do and how they do it and all of that. So
Yeah.
I think it's very much prominent in Hitchcock's work, because whether it's the psychosexual power play,
Right.
or if it's just the psychological personalities. I mean, take for instance, good old Norman Bates.
Oh, yeah.
Man, he had the Oedipus complex way out on the left field.
Mm-hmm.
So he took it to the next level.
Well, and his story, comes kind of, mainly from Ed Gein and the book by Robert Bloch about that.
Right. Yeah. But just the imagination of taking, now, I don't have a problem with screenwriters at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that, but I do have some issues with some that take too much creative license.
Yes, I agree. I totally
They take
agree.
away from the original book thing, because then we can fall into the whole Edgar Allan Poe and how they've recreated some of his stories.
Right. Right.
I think it's very interesting that Hitchcock never took any of Poe's works and redid them, even though he had that macabre and he had that horror and that psychological thrill.
Yeah. It's quite interesting, but then, and this kind of brings us kind of to one of the things that we're going to talk about as well. He didn't fully say this is the story of, the Telltale Heart. But
Right.
when you look at several of the elements in many of Hitchcock's movies, you can find Poe elements. I mean, they're staring
Absolutely.
right at you.
Absolutely. I mean, come on. You can think about the birds. Hell, that's the raven. I mean,
Right.
birds are the major aspects of it, in my opinion. And then you've got Vertigo.
And that's the story of Ligeia. I mean,
exactly. I mean, that's Ligeia's. So he did use, in my opinion, a lot of Poe story overtures.
Right.
In his works. When even though he was taking it from other people's writings, you can't tell me that he didn't somewhat interpret it his own.
Yeah.
With some Poe influence, in my opinion.
I agree, because I mean, when you think of Ligeia, the narrator is obsessed with her. Scotty, the retired, because he got hurt, police officer,
Yep.
he was obsessed with Madeline when Elster asked him to follow her, and then she died, Ligeia died, and then Rowena comes along, and then Judy comes along in the film Vertigo, and they both, in a way, want to do this recreation of Ligeia versus Madeline, and
Right.
so it's eerie when you think about it. And I had never really thought about this until doing this research, and so I'm like, how did I miss this?
Well, it also just goes back to the thing that sometimes you miss things because your brain looks over them because it
Yeah,
also makes the connection, so you don't really bring it out and look at it and say,
right.
oh, until something like this, you ask a question and you're going, huh, now I realize that,
Right. And again, I think I've mentioned this on Poe Unplugged multiple times. When I read with purpose and I watch with purpose, I pick up so much more than if I'm just doing it for pleasure,
Right. Yeah, and I mean that's the thing. When we read for pleasure, we're just doing that. We're reading for the pleasure that it gives us, both
Right.
on a mental, a physical, and an emotional level, and in some
Yeah.
aspects, spiritual level.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing, and this ties also into Vertigo as well as Ligeia, Poe and Hitchcock also did something else that in several stories and films where you've got the dual personalities. And so, like Vertigo, the Judy Madeline, Ligeia, Rowena, but then you've also got William Wilson and the Fall of the House of Usher. You got, the two William Wilsons. You've got the Fall of the House of Usher with the twins, Roderick and Madeline. Shadow of a Doubt, one of Hitchcock's great films with Joseph Cotton. You've got the two Charlies. He's Uncle Charlie and then his niece Charlie. And they're very much alike in a weird way, but the polar opposite. And Charlie, the girl, had to do something at the end. I'm not going to give spoilers away, to overcome the evil so she wouldn't turn into her uncle, know. And then Strangers on a Train. I love that one. Guy and Bruno. You've got the opposite, the antithesis of each other. And so it's just very interesting that duality theme going on.
Yeah. And I mean, every one of Hitchcock's recreations, we might as well just call them recreations since he's not the one that's doing the writing.
Yeah.
Creation or interpretation of someone else's work is very prominent, and you can see there's all these different influences that he's not only getting from, probably showing from his own point of view, but he's taking these writers and you can see the influence that the writers had in their stories.
Yeah.
It'd be kind of interesting to go back and look at the writers and see about who they got influenced by.
Yes, it really would.
That came about because, it goes all the way back, that 6 degrees.
Yeah.
You can't tell me that they weren't influenced by some of the greatest before them.
Yeah.
Influenced by the greatest before them. So it all kind of ties back to good old, Edgar Allan Poe.
It definitely does. And you also think too, like we're not even really touching on, the Alfred Hitchcock Presents or the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. There were, there were two creations of his TV show that he did. And so, but we're not even really touching on that. But I know there are several episodes. I've watched the series multiple times. The last time I watched it, I was actually looking for Poe connections, and I can't remember all the different episodes, but there's a lot of elements in there of Poe stories, but not written by Poe,
Right. And that's the thing. If they're alluding to or alluding to an author, if that can make that connection for you, that just makes it that much better. And just like I was looking at Spellbound, that's one thing that we haven't talked about. We talked about Vertigo, we talked about The Birds, Rear Window, Psycho, but Spellbound,
Oh yeah, that's such a good one. Yeah.
because Spellbound actually got Salvador Dali involved with that. I think that was the movie that Salvador Dali worked with Alfred Hitchcock on.
Yes, yes, and we talked about that in our
Yes,
episode about Dolly. It's
exactly.
realism.
Yeah, so the plot is ludicrous in its own way, but it is a psychological drama.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's one of those to where you're sitting back going, huh, okay.
Yeah, and this brings me to something that ties in perfectly with another thing that I found in my research is several people kind of said that both of them have what you would call like produce, I should say, the dreamlike state of the unnatural world. And for the film part of it, it's really called, they call them blots, stains on the natural order that disturb the narrator to get violently and irrationally. And
Yep.
so, one of the things that, kind of some examples of this was like Telltale Heart, you have the eye and the beating heart. The birds, you have the birds themselves. These are things in the unnatural order which cause chaos and bring about these stories. And so I thought that
Yep.
was a really interesting way to think about both of them and how they created their mediums.
Right. And I mean, it's very true. They have these creative aspects to them that were beyond their time, in my opinion.
Yeah.
They brought out something that people were either scared to do or had never thought about doing. But also, if we bring in the psychoanalytical parts of it and the surrealist part of it, we can also think about during that time frame who was getting very popular. The one major man that was very popular in the psychological world at that time was Sigmund Freud.
Right, absolutely. And, speaking of Spellbound, the older gentleman that plays the psychiatrist, that Ingrid Bergman's character, like that's her mentor.
Mm-hmm.
He reminds me of somebody like Freud.
Oh, absolutely. And you can definitely see the aspects that Hitchcock was playing with that. So
yeah,
I mean,
I agree.
because you had Carl Jung, you had all the greats that were coming out, B.F. Skinner with his behavioral analysis. All that was happening during that time. So
absolutely.
he was playing into the time frame.
Yeah, he definitely was. And another thing that Hitchcock is very, very popular for was the MacGuffin. And, those things that are kind of in plain sight and that distract you from the real thing going on. And, but one MacGuffin that's probably one of the best ones that he ever did was in North by Northwest. They're looking for George Kaplan, but he's not, he doesn't exist. Oops,
Right.
I should have said spoiler. I hope. Oops, sorry.
Oops.
Whoopsie.
Oops. Okay, spoiler alert, spoiler alert.
Yeah, and then for Poe, he used MacGuffins too, and I didn't trace the history of the word MacGuffin. We probably could look that up, but there is one very much in Poe's tale that was a C. Auguste Dupin story, The Purloined Letter. I'm not going to give away what it is if you haven't read it, so we'll keep that a secret.
Oh, yes. We don't want to give too much away because we've already been spoiling a few things.
Right, right.
Okay, so the definition, just so you want this.
Okay, nice. Glad you looked it up.
A MacGuffin is a plot device used in films or books that sets the characters into motion and drives the story. It's an idea, person, or goal that the characters are either in pursuit of or which serves as motivation for their actions. Usually the MacGuffin is revealed in the first act.
Yes, and it's such a distraction that it really takes away from what the real plot is going on. You
Yeah,
know,
it's kind of like the red herring.
it is in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah, and so even Merriam-Webster's dictionary definition
Yeah.
that Alfred Hitchcock was the very first person to use the MacGuffin as a word for a plot device.
Yeah.
It from an old Shaggy Dog story
Oh, interesting.
in which some passengers on a train interrogate a fellow passenger carrying a large, strange looking package. The fellow says the package contains a MacGuffin, which he explains is used to catch tigers in the Scottish Highlands. Who knew tigers were in the Scottish Highlands, first of all?
Yeah. But
When the group
MacGuffin's got to be Scottish.
Exactly. So when the group protests that there are no tigers in the Highlands, see, the passenger replies, well, then this must not be a MacGuffin. Hitchcock apparently appreciated the way the mysterious package holds the audience's attention and builds suspense. And he recognized that an audience anticipating a solution to a mystery will continue to follow the story, even if the initial interest grabber turns out to be irrelevant. So there you go, people. That's more knew about a whole MacGuffin. No,
Oh,
it's not a
yeah.
McGriddle that you get at McDonald's or
No.
that. So just in
Oh,
case you were wondering,
oh my goodness.
but it does make sense because MacGuffin has that Scottish, Irish tendency there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, a lot of people will get lost if they're looking at or watching mystery shows and stuff like that. Sometimes that red herring or that MacGuffin will
Yeah.
take so much interest that people will miss everything else that's going on, or they'll stay so fixated that they just can't give it up.
Yeah.
Think of
Absolutely.
MacGuffins that Poe had possibly used.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, just
Never paid any attention to it.
yeah, I mean, the one that is very obvious, like I said, is in the Purloined Letter, and you know which one I'm talking about, but I
Oh,
don't want to
yes.
give it away because it would give away the entire story.
Right.
But if we could probably sit here and think and analyze that for hours, but
Yeah.
we need to keep honed in, Jeanie.
Yes. Well, you got the start on the MacGuffin there. So,
Well, hey, that would be something that you could do in Time Talks with Jeanie.
that's true.
Poe's MacGuffins.
That's right. Like
There
that
you go. There
is
you go.
MacGuffin.
There's an episode down the road.
Down the road. Yeah, because not right now. Down the road.
Yeah, we'll have to. I'm going to write that down so we don't forget.
Time
But
talks with the MacGuffin.
yeah. But just kind of looking also at some of the other things with Hitchcock, we're kind of broke away from his biography and digressed a little, and that's okay because that's what we do. But his first color film was Rope. And one thing I want to point out about Rope, and that doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with Poe, but Hitchcock filmed that in two scenes, basically. When you see the editing, it was almost like a play that was filmed but beautifully done. And that's, to me, why that movie is so good, because it's so different than other films.
It very much so is. I mean, there's just so many things that when you find a film that just attaches to you,
Yeah.
that you won't ever forget it because you always keep coming back to it. It's like those movies you could watch numerous times over and over again. And even though you know what's coming and you know what's going to happen, you're very much involved because it's just that riveting.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away too much about that film, but there's definitely some essence of Poe in there, with what the rope was used for and things like that. Right. But again, not giving too much away. But Hitchcock also, he won 2 Golden Globes, some more awards, given out in England as well, 5 Lifetime Achievement Awards. He won he was nominated 5 times for an Academy Award for Best
Right.
Director in 1940. And then Rebecca won the Oscar for Best Picture. I think that was actually in 1940. And
Yeah.
then this is really cool. And I don't know that if I realize this or not, because nobody refers to him as this. In 1980, Queen Elizabeth II gave him a knighthood. She knighted him.
Oh,
Did you know that?
no, I never know he got knighted.
Yeah,
Because
which makes
most
sense.
of
I
them will
mean,
use sirs, in their
right.
names. I don't ever remember Alfred referring to himself as Sir Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah. I never, because,
Mm,
he died April 29th, 1980. I don't
right.
remember him ever being referenced, because we were old
Mm,
enough to remember that.
yeah. Well, let's not say that too loud too often.
Oh, I know. It's all right. But yeah,
True.
so,
Yeah.
he must have been knighted decently early in 1980 with him passing away in April. So,
True. And that may be why that they've not used it as a moniker. Him.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
A
I agree.
salutate or what do they call them?
Like a salutation.
Yeah, I think it might be a salutation. So
Yeah, yeah.
there's so many different things, because it's like
Oh
English
yeah,
language. You got 5 million things you can call one thing.
yeah. And again, I'm going to also mention something else. That we're mainly talking about Poe's horror, Hitchcock's horror, because both of
Mhm.
them. Poe's horror is not as much as what Hitchcock did, but
Right.
Poe had more satire stories than Hitchcock had satirical films. But
Right.
I just want to point out, Hitchcock's only comedy was Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and it's got Carol Lombard. And if you have not seen that film, it is fantastic. So, Hitchcock was a funny guy, off the set and that kind of thing, which Poe was too. And another dark satire that Hitchcock did was The Trouble with Harry. And
Right.
it's great. It's, John Forsythe, Shirley MacLaine, Edwin Gwynn. It is fantastic. And the little boy is Leave It to Beaver. It's
Oh yeah.
Beaver. And what's his name? What's the actor's name?
I don't know.
I
I
can't.
That's the thing. It's one of those where you know who that you can see him perfectly, but you can't ever remember his name.
Yeah,
Like Eddie. I can't ever remember who Eddie's real name is, but I remember
right.
who Eddie is.
Yeah, well, his mom was Barbara Billingsley and Hugh Beaumont was the father. I just, for whatever reason, it's gone out of my brain tonight.
Well, yeah.
So that's just
Hold on a second,
another,
I'll look it up.
that's another little commonality between Poe and Hitchcock was,
Mhm.
they were funny men.
Yes, they were. But and I have to bring this in, and we're not going to delve too far into it, especially
Right.
with Hitchcock. But
Yeah.
they had their vices that were very not appreciated in some circles.
Right. Yeah. With Hitchcock. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because he hit, Poe, he had his vice of alcoholism, you know, but that was about his major things. But, we've talked about his tragic lives and stuff.
Yeah.
But with Hitchcock, he had some vices that were actually, it was seen later, like in his career kind of thing, not
Yeah.
some beginning. So,
Very, very true. And
yeah.
and we know that Poe's alcoholism is excessively exaggerated.
Mhm.
He was not a drunkard his entire life or his adult life. And so
True.
that's one thing, I always like to remind everybody that he had, times where, he did drink, but it was not to the excess because he did have, there's no way to prove it now, but it was some kind of like either allergy or sensitivity to alcohol. And so one drink would make him maybe look more inebriated than somebody that would drink, a whole bottle of wine or 2 bottles of wine or something excessive like that.
Right. And you actually have to look into that time period of
Yeah,
how they were creating their drink. It
right.
was a lot stronger and a whole lot
Yeah,
less regulated than we have to deal with today.
yeah. Oh, I know.
But yeah, I just wanted to bring in that was some of the similarities that they had.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Had their own demons and their
Yeah.
own that they had to put up with, and which, if you look at it, that's part of the creativity life in some instances, that those that are touched with tragedy or anything dealing with that for their creative avenue
Right.
usually has center stage in their creations.
Yeah, I agree.
So, and that's, even though, like we said, Hitchcock did not write any of his, movies, he very
Right.
much used, and I think he chose some of his works based on his own life.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
Oh, I know. Well, I think we have really captured the connections between Poe and Hitchcock and influences Poe had on him on the Master of Suspense.
Right. And how they have touched lives in both of their mediums, whether it be through writings or portrayals in movies. They had
Yeah.
mediums that were well received with
Yeah,
their writing.
absolutely.
And we have to pay homage to both Poe and Hitchcock. Poe for being the father of the detective story, but also he was he was a person of the macabre and would bring in his horror aspects to things.
Yeah.
And he brought it into stories where Hitchcock brought it into film.
Yeah. And, I mean, Poe was kind of the master of the macabre and Hitchcock, master of suspense. And can you imagine them working together?
Wow, I can. And that's why I said I don't understand why Hitchcock never took one of Poe's stories and made a movie.
Yeah. And one thing I'm going to have to do, because there is one episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents that
Mm-hmm.
Poe is mentioned in it. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's toward the end of the run of his series. But I really would like to go through and see where the inspiration for some of these stories, came from, because, you know, I think it's Richard Matheson wrote several of the screenplays for the writing piece for this TV show. I think Robert Bloch did too. I know he did Twilight Zone.
Right.
So, but some great writers, on Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And so, yeah, I would love to go through. I have a book up on the shelf. I'm looking at it right now that I believe does show some of the episodes and like the ins and outs of, some of them. And so we'll just have to dig, Jeanie.
Yeah, we will. And I'm thinking that I think I actually have Alfred Hitchcock Presents over there in my AV cabinet.
Okay.
Remember if I've kept it or I got rid of it. So we'll probably have to.
Yeah. You can find it on streaming channels pretty
Right.
regularly. Yeah. And so every couple of years, I watch the whole thing, binge and everything else while I'm sewing. I'll watch it, and you cannot
Yeah.
go wrong.
Nope. Nope. Can't go wrong with Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, that's just like you can't go wrong with Edgar Allan Poe.
No, not at all. Two of the geniuses of horror and other things as well.
Exactly. The two fathers of them all,
Yeah,
both in the written word and in the visual word, in my, and yes,
exactly.
visual word because body language is very visual.
Absolutely.
All right, so I think on that aspect of it, we can say we are
Oh,
out. A wailing shriek, half of horror and half path of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation.